Hey everybody, CO, and welcome back to Comics and Dragons. I'm Lance White Eagle, and today we're going to be looking at the very basics of how to select your very first Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition character. When you're new to the game and look at all these options, it can be a bit much. So I like to simplify it as best I can for new players to ease them into the process because it's a fun game. You're going to enjoy it. And as easy as I can make it to get started and get going and having a good time, the better. So the way I start out with a new player, before we open the player's handbook, I ask them a pretty simple question. Do you want to be a martial character, a magic character, or a hybrid character? A character who can do a bit of both. And that one question narrows down this long list of options you have into a handful of groups. And once that choice has been made, you can go through what's remaining and pick from there. So let's say you and I are playing and you decided you wanted to be a martial class because martial classes are probably a little bit easier for brand new players. They're not necessarily simpler than magic classes. They just have less game mechanics involved that you need to know. So if you're using the basic rules, the free PDF, and I will for sure this time, because I think I've forgotten thus far, put that link in the description. You have two martial options. You have the fighter, which is pretty self-explanatory. That is your weapons specialist. And it can be ranged weapons, it can be close-up weaponry, but they are your combat weapon wielding specialist. And you have the rogue. The rogue is your stealth specialist, your infiltration specialist. And again, with rogue, you could be ranged or you can be a close-up combatant. All of the martial classes have both of those really as an option. Your class does not determine your weapons preference. That's up to the player, so don't feel like the class locks you into that. And as far as the basic rules go, that's it. You have those two choices. Do you want to be the combat guy or do you want to be the stealth? And there you have it. There's your class. If you're using the player's handbook, you do have more options, of course. You have the barbarian, which is, in kind of video game terms, the tank. The barbarians can take the most amount of damage in the game. And they also deal out a lot of damage. You have your monks, which are martial arts based. And, you know, there's your options. The full range of martial classes, you have your weapon specialist, the fighter, you have the stealth specialist, the rogue, you have the tank, the barbarian, and you have the martial artist, the monk. Now, if you decided that you wanted to play a magic caster, then it does get a little more complicated. The next question would be, do you want to be an arcane caster or a divine caster? Do you want to draw your power from kind of magic itself or from a god or nature? In the basic rules, that secondary question kind of locks you in. They have one arcane class, the wizard, which is a spellcaster that learns to use arcane magics through study. It is your basic fantasy magic caster. If you want to be a divine caster, in the basic rules, your only option is the cleric. Clerics get kind of stereotyped as healers, but really they can do a lot more than that. In Dungeons and Dragons, you have war clerics, you have trickery clerics, but they are a divine caster. They are getting their power from a god or a deity. In the player's handbook, you have, of course, more options. For arcane casters, you have the sorcerer, you have the warlock, and you have the bard. Sorcerers are similar to wizards, except they gain their power through natural abilities. Rather than study, they just can innately do magical spells and effects. The warlock draws its power from an outside force, from a patron. Generally, they have made a deal to get these abilities. And these patrons aren't necessarily divine. They aren't gods. It could just be a powerful being, an angel, a lich. There are a very wide variety of options for your warlock patron. And lastly, we have the bard. And the bard, as mentioned previously, does get overlooked sometimes, but they are a really cool option if you want your magic to come from art. Bards can derive their magic from music, from poetry, from epic tales. It just kind of depends on how you want to play it. If you're a musician, if you're an actor, this is probably a good class for you. And they have a lot of cool abilities to play with. So, those are your arcane casters for the player's handbook. As far as divine caster goes, your other option in the player's handbook is the druid. They are a nature-based divine caster. And they also get kind of a cool extra ability. They can turn into animals, which is really neat if, that sounds like something that interests you. So, to break it down, you have divine casters, you have clerics, and druids. You have arcane casters, which are your wizard, your warlock, your sorcerer, and the bard. Your other option, your other kind of field, are the hybrid classes, I call them. The classes that combine martial base with a handful of magic and magic abilities. You have the paladin in the player's handbook, which is a knight for the most part. Paladins are divine casters. They are drawing their power source like the cleric, generally from a divine entity or god. But they can also, depending on how you want to play your paladin, they can be drawing their power from their personal resolve, their own determination. They are my favorite class, so I might be a little biased, but they are a martial class that can use spells for healing and for augmenting their damage output, mostly. And they get a handful of utility spells, which are nice too. The only other mixed hybrid class is the Ranger. And Rangers are a martial class that has a handful of druid-like abilities. They are a nature-based caster. They're drawing their spells from the world. And most of their spells have to do with tracking, with stealth, with animals and plants. And they're a really neat class. Ranger a lot of times gets thought of only as a ranged class, only as bows, but the Ranger in 5th edition can be either ranged or combat. Really good example of that from pop culture is Aragorn and Legolas. If I was making those characters into D&D characters, they would both probably be rangers. And one, Aragorn, would just be more focused on close-up combat, and Legolas would be focused on ranged combat. And really, that's it. That's it for classes. There are subclasses. You're going to hit those with most of these at level 3. So don't worry about that right now. You are just starting out. You can choose that when you get there if you don't already know what you want to kind of focus on. Some of these you do have to pick your subclass, your focus at level 1. Clerics, I believe, warlocks do as well. But those are a little simple because it really comes down to where you're deriving your power from. The cleric domains just play into your character's background as far as which domain to pick. You know, what deity are you drawing this power from? And looking at it that way, it's a little simpler. You start out with 3 options: martial, magic, hybrid. And from there opens up to just these smaller chunks to choose from. And it's a lot more manageable that way, I think. Next, I generally go to races. A lot of DMs probably do it the other way around. You start with race and then go to class. But just for me personally, I found that people are more familiar with the archetypes of powers than necessarily all the races that are available. So after we've picked the class, we look at the races. And most of the time, I think your players, or the player, is already going to know. You're going to have a picture of this character in your head. You know what race you're probably leaning towards. But if you don't, there's a few ways to narrow that down. If you're using the basic rules, you only have 4 options. And they are the Lord of the Rings races. And I'm assuming if you guys are sitting down to play Dungeons and Dragons and you're at the point where you're picking a character, you've probably seen Lord of the Rings. and you've probably seen it more than once. So you're familiar with these guys. You have the dwarf, shorter, stocky, bearded. You have the elf, and Lord of the Rings elves are very similar to Dungeons and Dragons elves. They are lean, taller beings. You have the halflings, because you can't call them hobbits for legal reasons, which are smaller, really an odd race. How do you describe a hobbit? uh, they are kind of a nature dwelling based race in Dungeons and Dragons. They are happy go lucky, Frodo, Sam, Bilbo. And then, of course, you have your humans. Now, in none of my campaigns that I can recall have I actually had any players pick human, but they are a good race for Dungeons and Dragons, mechanically speaking. They get a good balance of stats and abilities and things like this. And that's it for your basic rules. In the player's handbook, you do have more kind of exotic, I guess you could say, racial options. You have the Dragonborn, which are a humanoid dragon species. You have gnomes, which are kind of hobbit-like, but they have different abilities. Some of the gnomes are like tinkerer based, mechanical based. Some of them are woodland based. They do differ from the halflings. You have half elves, who are half elf, half human, and they get a little bit of the elf abilities. They get a little bit of the human abilities. You have half orcs, which are half orcs. They're green. They got tusks. They are big, hardy, powerful, in general. And you have your tieflings. I've also heard it pronounced tiefling, but at my table we generally say tiefling. And they are a plane touched race. They are abyssal or infernal touched in some way. And what that means is they look a little creepy. They have horns, they have tails, they look a little demonic. They aren't necessarily no race in 5th edition is locked into a certain category of good or evil. Any race can be whatever they want. They are a free-willed individual. But aesthetically, they have that kind of creepy look. They are the, I guess, gothy race. And each race does get certain statistical bonuses and abilities. But when you're just starting out, I would recommend don't worry about that. Don't feel like I picked a bard, so I have to pick a tiefling because they get a charisma bonus. Because numbers aren't as fun. This is a game about story. It's a game about acting and playing out a character, and the numbers are not as important as the enjoyment that you get from pretending, from playing a character that you like and that you think is cool. And that's really what's important, right? This is a fantasy game. It's an escapist game. So pick what you think is cool. Pick what you think is fun. Um, Myself and most of my players, once we have a character, we go online and find different pictures and look for the right picture of, oh, this is what they look like, and we'll send it to the rest of the group. And that, I think, is more important than the statistics. If you are a numbers person, if you are a min maxer, you know, and that's fun for you, I'm not knocking you. Like go for it, you know. And I do that sometimes personally when I'm a player. But I think when you're new, don't worry about that as much. Worry about being something that you want to be. So to kind of break it down, and we're not going to talk about statistics and filling out your character sheet. We're going to do that in another video. This is your first step into your Dungeons and Dragons character. And that is, do you want to be martial, magic, or hybrid? And then, what do you look like? Are you short and stocky? Are you tall and lithe? Are you barefoot running through the Shire? Are you a human? Or are you something more abnormal and exotic? And that's really all you need. You have created a class and a race, and you have a mental image of your character. If you want to even simplify it further, and you know you're getting ready to play a game of Dungeons and Dragons, look at some of the characters in your favorite movies or TV shows or comics or books, and just pick one. Pick one that you like. And your DM can probably help you make that character or a close facsimile to it. The Lord of the Rings characters are super easy. You know, Gimli is a fighter. Legolas could be a fighter or a ranger. You know, Aragorn is a ranger. Any character really can be broken down into these kind of more simplified archetypes, and that may be an easier way for you to do it. But if you want to come up with something just on your own, I'd say take these handful of questions and go from there. And really, that's it. I think that's our introduction to your first character. And if you have any questions, be sure to put them in the comments. I will get to them. I'll answer them. And I think our next video is going to be prepping your first Dungeons and Dragons adventure as a dungeon master. And that can be a little tricky. There are other videos on that out there, but if you guys want my opinion on it, we'll talk about what I do to prep a session and maybe give you some tips for getting started as a dungeon master. So I hope that helped you guys. Whoever's getting into the hobby, let me know if you're just getting started or looking to get started. And while you're down there in the comments, be sure to like, subscribe, and share if you wish. Hit the little bell icon if you want to be notified when a new video goes up. And until next time, happy trails, and thank you for watching Comics and Dragons.